Hello, welcome to AJ in Review at Think Tech Hawaii. And I'm your host, Hong Jiang, and we're broadcasting live from Pioneer Plaza at downtown Honolulu. So my guest today is Dr. Chris McNally, Associate Professor of Political Economy from Chaminade University. And today's topic is challenges to China's rise. And a lot of people have known about China. There are a lot of issues there. Environmental issues you hear a lot about, human rights issues. But today we are going to focus on the political, economic, and also geopolitical issues. And of course, our guest today, Chris, is the foremost expert on these issues. And Chris, so great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Maybe we can, I know the show you did early on with our producer, Jay Fidel, talks about China's economic transformation plans, and our viewers can go to the YouTube website and find out that show. But today, we're looking at challenges. And maybe we can start from the third plenum that the Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee just went through and had some major reform plans, especially for the economy.
Actually, yeah, social and economic aspects of China.
Yes. Yeah. So let's start from domestic political economic challenges there that you see. Give us some background of the challenges you see, and also is the third plenum meeting helping to address some of these issues, how successful they could be.
So first out, when the third plenum first issued its communique, which was just the day that the plenum finished, people were quite disappointed because it was full of platitudes. It was very vague and rather general in its statements. But several days later, basically a much longer basically report of the plenum came out, which included something like 60 different reforms. Most of these reforms are linked in that they're trying to change the way the government interacts with both society and economy. In terms of society, actually, it's just the government gradually stepping back, and some of the reforms, like for the one-child policy or for the hukou, which is the urban residency system, the urban-rural residency system, are kind of very gradual baby steps that start to withdraw direct government control. Economically speaking, the biggest challenge is clearly rebalancing China's political economy. Now, what do they mean with rebalancing? They basically are trying to move away from the system that has produced enormous growth over the last 30 years, but was very dependent on exports and investment. And the idea is basically to reduce dependence on exports. That means demand in other markets like the United States and Europe, but also gradually move away from really what has been an enormous amount of investment that has been driving the economy. And most economists in China and outside of China agree that by now, if you continue with this amount of investment, you'll face increasingly lower returns and therefore more waste, more inefficiencies. And so the idea is, how do they change this model without fully liberalizing the economy into something like the United States? And even the US is actually heavily regulated in various corners and aspects of the economy. But how do you really move away from what has been enormous dependence on big investments in real estate? The real estate market is too hot. Exactly. In infrastructure, a lot of that probably gets used at some point. Yeah, they might be building huge bridges, but I've seen lots of this in China where you had a freeway that was totally empty, and 5 years later you have traffic jams. And then number three, huge investments by the big state-owned enterprises in heavy industry, and lots of it is very polluting and inefficient and overly much. So you have huge overcapacity from steel to cement to aluminium. We might be actually even getting there with cars, but so far actually the car companies have been able to sell what they've been producing, but there's huge investments that should be coming on stream in the next 2 to 3 years. And also a whole host of other areas of especially heavy industry where there's been, really too much capacity and overinvestment. So those are kind of the three areas where there's been, where the problems are. And the whole idea is to move away from this by what is emerging as quite an interesting kind of group of reforms that don't tackle some problems head on, like the state-owned enterprises. So
That's what I heard, that there's a contradictory in the new reform policy, that the state wanted the reform, at the same time still hold on to the state-owned enterprise.
Yes, so there's no idea whatsoever of privatizing the state-owned enterprises, especially the big ones. And even for the smaller ones, of which many probably could easily put in private hands without influencing the government's capability of influencing and controlling the economy, even there actually there's not that much noise being made. The main part that really concerns state-owned enterprises is primarily changing the environment around them. So the state should much more act like a real shareholder and collect dividends from the state-owned enterprises. That means less profits are left in the state-owned enterprises. That means they have less opportunity to invest them in wasteful manners. You know, and lots of these enterprises have built headquarters that are huge, absolutely, you know, which, you know, if not bordering on waste, at least is somewhat opulent. And so taking out the profits from them, and at the other hand is really financial reforms that basically mean that the state-owned enterprises have to pay market rates for the loans they take up, and that will influence how much they can invest. So, and then you have a whole host of other reforms in terms of, you know, marketizing the economy further and trying to instill more competitive pressures into some of the markets. But really, I don't see the bigger markets like telecommunications, like oil and gas, like a lot of the more heavy industries where there's probably going to be lots of change. Maybe steel, maybe in cars, where cars already actually are in a very competitive market. There you could maybe see some changes, but for the most part, as you said, the problem is not being tackled head on. It's, you know, trying really change these state-owned enterprises themselves. No, they're keeping them. They're very large. They're going to continue to be very large, but try and change the environment around them. And that probably will end up in another one of these kind of Chinese hybrid reforms, you know, where they tackle part of the problem sufficiently enough to keep the economy going.
Keep the criticisms lowered, you know.
Somewhat, yeah, but I think amongst the Chinese people it's going to be tough, because I think they've made up their minds that these big state-owned enterprises, for the most part, actually are ripping them off, especially the telecoms carriers. And I try to remind them that actually it's much cheaper in China than it is in the United States. So, and in the United States, we also have a similar situation where we only have 4 big companies, you know, that have the infrastructure set up. So, but you get these problems actually in any market economy, and China is trying to deal with them somewhat differently, basically by keeping state ownership over what is called the commanding heights, you know, the very big companies in key areas, the definition of which is probably going to change over time, but they want to keep that control intact while really marketizing the economy. And probably the most important part of that is financial reforms.
That's definitely needed, because the Chinese banks were in a lot of trouble.
They still are. I mean, the Chinese banks basically had 2 phases of liberalization. The first one was in the 1990s, where, you know, they racked up huge amounts of bad debts. So 1992 to 1995 was kind of the boom years, and then over the debts just kept going. And only in 1997, 1998, on the Zhurongji, did they start to actually implement some reforms. And over time, those reforms became strong enough that they could carve out the bad loans, you know, put them in separate entities, what are called the asset management companies, and gradually digest them, but they mainly digested them by the economy growing. So they have not been very successful in gaining lots of returns on what were non-performing loans. The second phase was basically the big stimulus of 2009, 2010, and again, we are sitting there where the Chinese banks for sure have bad loans, quite a few of them, more than they probably recognize on their books. And the idea is basically to force them to recognize these bad loans, to again probably give them to the asset management companies that then, so there's the Cinda, for example, which was the asset management company that took loans from China Construction Bank. They just listed yesterday in Hong Kong, and they issued additional shares actually. And their price has been going through the roof, basically because people think, oh, we're going to get another phase of this. So this is going to be kind of the same thing that happened. You know, you had a boom 2008, 2009, 2010, and 3, 4, 5 years later, the government finally gets its act together and then shifts these bad loans into these specialized entities that then need to get marketized returns. And there's lots of foreign investors that are very interested in that because they're the best at doing that. There's, you know, market economies like the US and Europe, the UK, Australia, etc., have a lot more experience in dealing with these kinds of problems. I mean, we look at the United States, we've had lots of bad loans too.
That's right. It's unavoidable in a kind of economy. It's just a matter of magnitude.
Yes.
And also structure is an important one because apparently, you know, the Chinese political structure is still remaining, and the Chinese has a saying like a 雷声大雨点小, a big thunder and small raindrops. And I just wonder whether this third plenum economic reform is going to end up just like that. And you have these big words about you know, reform, and the new administration has this new image like a Chinese dream, and it's very, very vague. And you don't know how that's going to be realized and how people are going to benefit from it, right? And also, how is it that the political reform is not part of the vision, and how that's going to hinder the economic reform? That's going to be a major question as well, right?
Yeah, one of the more interesting things, I mean, political reform in the Western conception is not on the table. So something moving towards multi-party democracy and even, you know, greater amounts of freedom of speech.
Just media
freedom actually has been
it's
even
heightened.
more constrained. Yeah,
That's
the clampdown on media has actually increased, but you also have at the same time new things like Weibo and Weixin that continue to basically, you know, provide some form, some outlet that didn't exist at something like 5 years ago. So it's difficult to judge, you know, in a sense what you have is the technology and the people's kind of yearning for more media freedom has created more space, while the government gets scared and then clamps down more. So it's this kind of, you know, it's a kind of cat and mouse game that is ongoing. It's been ongoing for the last 20 years since, you know, media liberalization really started to take off. I would actually argue that right now you still have more openness in China than you had even just a few years back, despite the clampdown. It's just they're clamping down so hard because you have more openness. So,
that's right. Yeah, definitely. You know, the internet is a kind of a great opportunity for the Chinese people to express themselves.
Yes.
That's for sure. Yeah.
But overall, I mean, if you look at the third plenum, the only real part that I would consider is quite fascinating is concerning the legal system. And the Western press has mainly reported that they're trying to phase out the death penalty for various crimes, so really reduce the amount of death penalty being used. And obviously, the reform through labor camps are going to be abolished and replaced with something like community prisons or similar. But
my concern is that it's changing names, but not really the content. I mean, you talk about. I've already been reading about it, like labor camps are being phased out. At the same time, it's moving into a different venue.
They still have some community, and you probably still will have tools of oppression. It's just maybe not going to be quite as crass as what you had. You can't be put away for 2 years. You maybe just may be able to be put away for 1 month or 2 months or something like that.
Yeah.
We don't know, and it's going to depend again a lot on the locality. You're absolutely right that you have. I mean, the crux of the matter is going to be in implementation. How are they going to implement the whole host of these reforms? And I'm sure that if you go to some places like Shanghai or Zhejiang, the more richer and open provinces, you might actually have some really thoroughgoing reforms. And ultimately, it depends on how the cadres will be evaluated. So it depends on how strong is going to be the center in implementing these policies and making sure that the people who follow the spirit of these policies, let's say, Xi Jinping's, that they will actually be the ones who move up within the system. And then you can actually really change the system. If that is not the case, and you saw that under Jiang Zemin and then Hu Jintao, basically their power has been diminishing. And Hu Jintao in particular probably was quite a weak leader, you know, given the resources that he actually could marshal.
That's right. Well, the prior leader was Jiang Zemin was still holding on to power in a lot of cases.
He had influence over a whole host of people. It was a very slow transition. Now, if you look at Xi Jinping, it looks like he's been able to, really assert his authority a lot more rapidly than the other two, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. So he certainly will be the strongest leader since Deng Xiaoping. How strong, that still is a big question, especially once you go down to the local level and you can get all kinds of passive resistance and other things. It's a huge country.
Definitely. This is a good time to take a break.
Okay.
This is Asia in Review at Think Tech Hawaii, and I'm your host, Hong Jiang, and we've been talking about challenges to China's rise, and we'll be right back after a short break.
We want to thank our underwriters.
Hawaiian Electric Company and its affiliates Maui Electric on Maui and Hawaii Electric Light Company on Hawaii Island are deeply committed to the communities they serve.
Galen Ho is a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company.
The High-Tech Development Corporation, the state's leading technology agency, attached to the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism.
Castle and Cook Hawaii, with a time-honored legacy that spans more than 160 years and revolves around its mission of investing in Hawaii, creating communities, and providing for the needs of our state.
Hawaii Gas, formerly the Gas Company, a proponent of the Liquefied Natural Gas Initiative, helping Hawaii achieve its transition to clean energy and a better energy future.
Collateral Analytics, a Hawaii-based tech company empowering the real estate industry with greater and faster access to the tools and data they need to make better informed property investment decisions.
I'm Nicole Horry. Thanks so much for joining us on Think Tech.
I'm Maria Kashem. See you next time.
Hi, we're back. We're live, and this is Asia in Review at Think Tech Hawaii, coming to you from Pioneer Plaza at downtown Honolulu. And we've been speaking with Professor Chris McNally about challenges to China's rise. So, Chris, right before the break, we're just getting into some of the challenges of the economic reform coming from the third plenum. One thing that's interesting, just last week we had somebody coming in, Professor James Cook, coming in to talk about China's environmental problems. And one figure he gave was 8 to 12% of China's economic growth is consumed by environmental problems, environmental pollution. So in a way that China's economy is not really growing at the rate that it's said to be growing. And right now, I suppose part of the reason for the economic reform is because the economic engine is really slowing down. And changing the engine from investment, from export into some kind of a domestic consumption there. Any challenges there in terms of growing the domestic consumption, keep the growth numbers?
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges they're facing is that you don't have enough consumption demand. Now, there's huge debates on that. The Chinese data are not very reliable. So Wang Xiaolu of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences has actually done separate surveys where he argues that actually consumption is higher. Income is higher, the economy is actually larger, but it's so skewed. The income inequalities are higher than what even the government reports, and those are already very high. Government is about 0.47 on a Gini scale. That's really bad. That's a bit worse than the United States. And then China should be, according to Professor Wang, about around 0.5, 0.51, so which is really Latin American. Only African countries have such huge inequalities. And that is really one of the biggest problems that they're facing, is that China has gone full, has moved into full bridal capitalism with often very weak regulatory systems and also quite weak taxation systems, especially for income tax. And what you find is a country where, not much unlike the United States, you have a huge mass of people that really don't have a lot of consumption power and a very narrow, in a sense, top. that does actually consume quite intensely. So China already has become the largest market for luxury goods.
That's right.
You know, BMW has had 2 wonderful years in China, and so on. So this inequality, you do have actually. Consumption has been growing quite well, and it's been growing faster than economic growth. So, and again, there are debates about what exactly the ratio is. Some have argued it's actually better because a lot of consumption is not captured in data. But overall speaking, you still have a problem where you need to lessen these wealth gaps. And it's going to be very difficult for the party, because actually the party itself is one of the most important vested interests that has benefited from this enormous growth and also wealth gap. And it's the party and its offspring and, you know, their various kind of affiliated interests, including state-owned enterprises that, by the way, pay very well. They have wonderful fringe benefits. So if you can get a job in a state-owned enterprise, it's actually quite a secure future. And all of these play into this problem. And it's going to be very difficult to disentangle it and implement something like probably stronger income taxation as well as much stronger welfare supports.
And a lot of it does come back to this one-party system, the political structure over there, because you talk about how the top, small percentage of people are benefiting from Chinese economic growth, and those people are mostly connected to the party. And
some way or another, most of them are, yes.
Yeah, and another thing, the word you use is a crony capitalist, right?
Yeah,
the connection between the officials and the capital over
the
there.
problem with that statement is, as a political economist, is we find some of the most unequal societies in what are nominally democracies. So, and even India, which actually had also quite an equal income distribution up until roughly the 1980s, as they have implemented market reforms, their inequality has gone through the roof as well. And that's a healthy multi-party democracy in a developing country. So we also have various developing countries where we probably would argue that they do not have a healthy multi-party democracy. But India is a good example where, although their inequalities are less than China's, they're getting very close. And you see many other examples of that. So it's probably more a problem of capitalism per se, and especially free market capitalism without strong social welfare supports, strong income redistribution systems, something that has been, throughout the world. We've seen this, not just in developing countries, but also the United States, the United Kingdom, even Europe, even Sweden, countries that have very equal income distributions. They're more unequal now, although they're still a lot better than the US or China. So it's a complicated problem, and what the government is trying to do is basically address it again with very statist solutions. And it's going to be interesting to see how far that's going to work, because they're basically taking a page out of Singapore's and Hong Kong's playbook and trying to establish huge amounts of public housing, ideally integrated into urban infrastructure. But again, the problem is, are these people going to find jobs? Are they just going to be dependent on minimal welfare handouts? A whole host of kind of these urbanization problems is going to creep up on China.
Yeah. One of the shows we did at Asia in Review early on was on the housing bubble. And there it was like there was a deep trouble connected to the political kind of structure, political economic structure of the one-party system there. And you talk about how a lot of it really is depending on implementation. And the implementation is a major part of the core of the problem, because you have the party making the decision and it's doing the implementation and it's benefiting from it. So in a way that you can't separate these different kind of voices. There's not a check and balance in the system. And the environmental regulations is also an important example. China has a good regulations, but China's environment, you can see the result there. So
really bad.
That's definitely. So maybe we can move on to talk about integrating Chinese economy with the global economy, because we already talked about China. The growth, much of it was relying on export-related, investment-related activities, and as China is moving more toward domestic consumption, China's economy is also integrating more with the global economy.
Yeah, China already actually is in several global markets by far the most important player, and that's mainly commodities. So if you look at iron ore, zinc, various copper, metals, etc., China is always the biggest producers of rare earths. So it sits on the other side. It's actually the biggest supplier. But in all of these areas, and including things like cotton and also grains now, soybeans, so international agricultural commodity trade, China is often the biggest buyer in the world. And as a result, the Chinese are trying to basically bring these markets on shore. So rather than being dependent on London or New York or Chicago in the United States to trade these commodities, they're actually increasingly trying to use Shanghai or Beijing to become the central markets globally. But to do that, they have to have a more open financial system. So if they want to be a big part of the global system of trading these commodities, they have to be a big part of the global financial system. In particular, financial flows have to be much freer in moving in and out of China. And right now the Chinese have very strict capital controls. That means you can move money in for investment, you can move money in for family purposes, etc., up to a certain amount, and for trade, but you cannot just freely say, I'm going to go into Shanghai and I'm going to be buying futures or equities or whatever, bonds. So one of the biggest issues that the third plenum is addressing is trying to open this up. And as before, what the route the Chinese are taking is again a roundabout route, where they are setting up the Shanghai Free Trade Zone, and there's a few others, one in Shenzhen, Tianjin, and other places in China, Xiamen, that are kind of vying to get on to this bandwagon. But the most important one is going to be Shanghai. And what they're trying to do is give companies that register in this free trade zone, which by the way is very small, it's 26 square kilometers, so it's not very big. It's like downtown Honolulu roughly in size, slightly bigger. Where these companies register, that they can then freely basically move money in and out. The question is going to be, what's going to happen once they're in this zone, they have the money, can they move it into Shanghai? Basically, the Chinese are opening up a channel, for capital to flow more freely. They always can close down this channel, at least, in the next 2 to 3 years probably. But this will actually change the Chinese economy, probably in a very gradual manner and in a manner that is controllable, but it'll become much more internationalized. And that will also mean that the Chinese currency itself, the yuan, which already has become the 9th most traded currency globally, so which is kind of interesting. You have a currency that you can trade freely, but it's already the 9th most important in terms of how much it's traded globally. That currency also will become a lot more important globally.
Last few years, you hear a lot of pressure from different countries, U.S. included, about kind of liberal policies from China in terms of the yen control. Is that still an issue now? You hear it kind of less now.
Yes, it's become less of an issue. One of the reasons is that, especially in the last year, one of the reasons is the year before, 2012, the biggest currency manipulator probably were the Swiss, because they pegged their currency to the euro and had to massively intervene in foreign exchange markets. And the Japanese have done something with their quantitative easing, as the United States. So it's become a very messy system where basically if you blame the Chinese just can throw it back at you and blame you and say, look, you're doing similar things. You're printing money to buy lots of assets in your economy, and that ultimately dilutes the price of your money. It's supply and demand. You supply a lot more of it, the price should drop. So the United States has been doing that with the US dollar, the British with the pound, and especially now the Japanese with the yen, actually quite effectively in the case of Japan. So pressure on China has diminished, but the other reason is that the Chinese themselves have step by step moved in the direction of trying to liberalize their currency. So you have and also in the last year, the Chinese currency has been the best performing in Asia. All other Asian currencies have been actually devaluing quite rapidly. Both the yen, as I mentioned, because of their own kind of quantitative easing, and then Indonesia and other currencies like the Thai baht, sometimes because of internal political problems, but also because the Federal Reserve is going to stop quantitative easing, and so money has started to flow out of these what are considered high-risk areas. The Chinese, on the other hand, are being treated a lot more like the dollar already. So this is kind of interesting. The Chinese are a developing economy. It's a one-party system, authoritarian. No rule of law, anywhere close to what you'd expect in most OECD countries, especially the US or, Europe. But nonetheless, you have basically when things are going wrong, capital flows into China. So China is seen as actually a safe haven. That's kind of an interesting new concept as we move along.
Yeah, and also, you know, as the U.S. Economy is suffering, how does this currency relationship here, you know, the Chinese yen is becoming more accepted or strong, and vis-a-vis the political relationship between China and U.S., coming back to China-U.S. here. And what's related to this here is everybody saying, oh, the Chinese government owes, or U.S. owes the Chinese government a lot of, it's the debt issue, the government debt issue. Yeah.
So that's kind of what you're getting. You know, what you're trying to ask is really what is going to happen between the United States and China in terms of the financial relationship, and that's that's complicated.
That's right. Yeah, it is.
It's very complicated because so far, basically, the United States has had the upper hand. No doubt. I mean, this is, although Americans often will feel, oh, we owe the Chinese so much money, now the Chinese can exact the price. That's not quite true because...
That's what I try to understand, because everybody's saying, oh, you know, we can't say anything about China's problems because, you know, they basically, you know, we owe them so much money.
Yeah, and actually the United States still criticizes China and China criticizes the U.S. I don't think that actually the U.S. government has changed its tack in that sense. I think it's more China's comprehensive economic power that is gradually changing, you know, the relationship between the two countries, especially huge American investments in China. See, that's where China is very different from Japan, is that we have, the United States has an enormous stake in China's well-being, much bigger stake than it ever had in Japan. So from an economic point of view. So that's kind of changes the relationship. But to come back to the financial situation, so far the United States, because the United States issues the US dollar, which is the world's reserve currency and really quite dominant, 60+% of reserves in the globe overall are in US dollars. That means everybody uses it as their main means of saving. And if something goes wrong globally, even if it's in the United States, as happened with the housing bust, people go to the dollar. The dollar is the safe haven. It still is, absolutely.
That's good to hear.
And the United States owes China so much that if China were saying, oh, we're going to dump, you know, U.S. bonds, basically bonds are going to drop, the dollar is going to drop, the yuan is probably going to go, you know, up in value, and so much that it's going to hurt China, probably much more than, you know, the price they could exact on the United States. Indeed, the U.S. might even be happy if their currency drops.
So we're all linked in this.
We're really linked in this, but the problem becomes if you look 5 to 10 years into the future, and if the Chinese really do internationalize their currency, and people start to use the Chinese currency increasingly as a funding currency for international trade, but also investments, and also as kind of a safe haven, a place to put your savings, you know, you have your nest egg. And many argue that that is unlikely because of, first of all, the Chinese currency is not freely tradable, so you don't want to go into something you cannot get out of.
That's right.
And two, because of the one-party system, because you have a political system that still is really lacking in transparency. You don't have full, you know, rule of law. But again, the Chinese are trying to do reforms. Again, in the Shanghai Free Trade Zone, they're basically talking about importing more or less the Hong Kong legal system full scale. So it's going to be interesting how this is going to kind of work out. I'm still trying to really figure out on my own, you know, analytically, whether they can pull it off. But the one thing is, first of all, probably shouldn't bet against the Chinese looking at the economic track record so far. And second of all, size makes a huge difference. So once China is the biggest economy globally, automatically people will perceive it as less risky than it is perceived even now. So, the United States has a lot going for it, and we're going to be in a kind of transitional arrangement that's going to be very interesting, and probably is going to create a lot of uncertainty and also a lot of volatility in financial markets over the next decade.
Okay, this is a good time to take another break. And this is Asia in Review at Think Tech Hawaii. And we've been talking about challenges to China's rise. And we'll be right back.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Horry for Think Tech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Hori. Mahalo.
Hi, we're back. We're live. This is Asia in Review at ThinkTech Hawaii, and we've been speaking with Professor Chris McNally about challenges to China's rise. So time goes fast, and let's look into the geopolitical challenges. Just recently, we have read about the East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone that's brought up by the Chinese government, and it's kind of run into conflicts with the surrounding countries like Japan, like South Korea, and it's creating such a stir there. And using that as a launch pad to look at geopolitical challenges to China overall.
I think the most profound challenges you will face in the next decade are of the more geopolitical and then geoeconomic nature. So it's kind of, as China emerges as by far, the largest economy in Asia, and probably will overtake the United States somewhere, could be 2020 at the very earliest, but more likely something like 2022, 2023. And it depends, you could have big problems in China or problems in the United States. Both countries face distinct challenges as they go forward, though the United States is probably going to grow quite steadily over the next, I would suspect, 6-7 years, at a 2.5 to 3% which is okay, but it's not good enough, to really solve the unemployment problem. In China's case, I believe that growth is going to gradually decline, and over time probably get closer to 5% a year. But that would probably be about 5, 6, 7, 8 years out. By that time, though, once China reaches that size, you will see that the East Asian order as it has been established, especially after the Second World War, which is basically still the Cold War order. It still is the same kind of dividing line in Asia that we had during the Cold War.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
With maybe the exception of Vietnam, which is now trying to get closer to the United States. But if you look at Europe, the border has been shifted far eastward and is much more fluid, with Ukraine right now being kind of the area where both Russia and the European Union are vying for primary leadership and influence. But if you look at Asia, we're still basically where we were roughly 25 years ago. And China is trying to change that status quo, because it's not in China's interest. It sees the world as being defined in a way that has constricted China, that has, in the case of the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands, taken something away from them, what they think is rightfully theirs. You can debate that historically, but that feeling basically is prodding China to seek to move out, to press out the other countries and territories, that are either aligned with the United States or close to the United States. And the ultimate goal is to push the United States out.
And the effect of that, at least as we can see, that China is creating conflicts with its neighbors, and that relationship with the U.S. is also at stake here.
Yes, but the United States being an offshore balancer, meaning the United States itself doesn't have much people and territory in the region, does behave differently from the countries in the region. And the countries in the region themselves have a lot of differences of opinion. So what the Chinese are trying to do is push enough that they might have the Japanese up in arms against them, but not, or the Filipinos, but not everybody else. And so far they've been pushing, and they've been certainly ruffling a lot of feathers.
That's right.
But we've had no major incident, thankfully. And the Chinese probably feel, yeah, they're getting their way. I mean, if you look at this gradual kind of encroachment that they're playing here. And for the United States, it's a very, very difficult situation to be in. Despite the pivot or the rebalancing that the Obama administration has announced, it is very difficult if you are up against a colossus. I mean, if you're up against a country of 1.3 billion people, that is in the region, that now has the second largest economy, that has rapidly increasing defense budgets and also rapidly increasing technological levels, it gets quite difficult. So, and again, you have one of the difficulties facing the United States is that you have also very different opinions, let's say, just between South Korea and Japan. or between Thailand and the Philippines, or Indonesia and the Vietnam. So, and the United States, this is a very basically difficult game of chess in which China sits in the middle and is playing it every day, full,
exactly.
with full attention. And the United States is really partially distracted and has a lot of other obligations and a lot of other things going on.
And I know in China, China has, the government has been portraying this image of a peaceful rise among the Chinese people.
Peaceful development is the official.
Peaceful development.
They even didn't like rise.
So in a way that I think the world, countries around China and also world at large would be somewhat concerned about whether this rise is going to be peaceful, and also whether China is going to play a positive role in the development of nations globally. A positive role, I mean, not just economic size, but also there are also other values, fairness and value, and being a good player in the global economy and global affairs. And that would also come back to look at Chinese system, not just the economy, but the political system is really a sticky point, I think.
And it's a big handicap for them from a soft power point of view. You cannot be very attractive, although the system in some sense is quite efficient and has its supporters. There's lots of countries in the world, and especially Africa, and even in India, there's a lot of people who actually are in awe of how rapid the system is able to put in place infrastructure, but it is not very attractive to the broader masses of people throughout the world. There's no doubt about that. And it's going to be interesting to see how this is going to play out, whether the Chinese themselves actually are going to implement political reforms, that give citizens better protected and more secure rights, including not just property rights, but also increasingly civil rights. And this is going to be a very difficult thing to see as we move forward. But for now, the Chinese themselves are quite adamant that they do not want to create frictions or any major skirmish. And I personally believe that a military conflict is highly unlikely. But we could have incidents as just between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War, where there was clearly a security competition, which I think is already ongoing. So. What we can hope for is that we have security competition without something that really breaks out into the open.
Yeah, that's definitely to the benefit of everybody in the world.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's take the last short break. This is Asia in Review. We've been talking about challenges to China's rise. We'll be right back.
Aloha. I'm Jay Fidel for ThinkTech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaiian Foreign Trade Zone, number 9, has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBED, the Hawaii Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program. It does so to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Jay Fidel of ThinkTech. Mahalo.
Hi, we're back. We're live, coming to you from Pioneer Plaza at downtown Honolulu. This is Asia in Review, and we've been talking with Professor Chris McNally about China's challenges to China's rise. So, talking about China's connection with the world, the economic connection with the world, and challenges there. One of the things, just a lot in the next few minutes, maybe you can help us address is this implication of resource needs. China has this great resource needs, and it's drawing on resources in the world.
And it's much more resource deficient than the United States. I mean, the United States is actually a very, very lucky country in the sense that we have huge amounts of agricultural land. We were the breadbasket of the world during basically the 19th century. And as we ourselves obviously been growing, we've been consuming lots of our food, but we still can actually produce a very large surplus for export. We also have found shale gas and shale oil. So there's a huge energy boom in the United States, and likely the United States will become energy independent, that's very difficult to define, but the United States likely by 2015 will be the largest energy producer globally, though it will still consume most of this at home. It takes a few more things to become an exporter. We can't export crude oil, for example, and we don't have the infrastructure to export LNG, liquefied natural gas. So it's going to be interesting to see how China itself develops, because the Chinese, unlike the United States, are facing increasingly fewer domestic resources, especially oil and gas, although they could have the largest amount of shale gas globally, but it will be very difficult to retrieve. China also faces a huge lack of water, which is very important to get shale gas out of the ground. And increasingly already has faced huge amounts of deficiency in things like iron ore and various other metals. So, but the biggest problem for China really is actually oil, which probably increasingly will be coming from the Middle East. And as a result, you could see that the geoeconomics are clearly ahead of the geopolitics, but in economic sense, China is already much more dependent on the Middle East than the United States.
And there are a lot of concern about China's demands really increase the price of energy.
Yes, that for sure. But we are right now in a situation where in the global oil market, there's always a lot of factors playing in. It's a global market ultimately, and so you did have the sanctions on Iran. You did have huge drop-offs in production in Libya. And at the other hand, you do have increases in production in the United States. And if Mexico gets its act together, Mexico could come on stream, as well as Canada and lots of other non-OPEC countries, Brazil.
And Russia became a player.
It's very large, but its increases haven't been as fast, though they could increase. And Russia actually is doing a very interesting geopolitical reorientation, which is away from Europe, which has been its main market for gas and oil, to Asia and in particular China. So there's a lot of talk between the Russians and the Chinese of actually integrating, but the problem has been price. So the Russians want a very high price, and the Chinese are not willing to pay for it. But we're likely to see some breakthroughs in coming months, if not years, probably in months. But even if that happens and China can have a lot more energy coming in from the north, from Russia, it is likely that its dependence on the Middle East will continue to increase. And that puts China right front and center in the Middle East, where it actually has very little, both military and political influence. So we will be seeing some very interesting kind of changes in the relationships of these countries, both with the United States, but also with China and then vis-a-vis each other.
We have couple more minutes. I want to bring up this other issue of China's connection with the rest of the world, like China's investment connection in Africa, Latin America. There are some of the concerns I read from African countries that Chinese economic connection with them is not really helping them in a way that it's extraction of resources.
Yes, and you do see this pattern, basically. You could argue that the Chinese are certainly better than the European colonialists, and maybe even slightly better than the United States, although the United States never really went into Africa the same way that China is. Even Latin America, actually, the United States never, in the 19th century, yes, with the building of the Panama Canal, for example. But right now, China is investing huge amounts in African infrastructure, with the main purpose of actually, in some cases, the countries themselves, like Kenya, is building an integrated railway network that is being built by the Chinese and being supported by Chinese finance. But Kenya is not a big producer of energy resources, etc. But once you go inland to Uganda, then yes. So basically, the Chinese are trying to build African infrastructure. I think first of all because they have so much overcapacity in China in the companies that build infrastructure that they need to find outlets. So we still have kind of an export dependency, but now it's not just producing things for Walmart, it's actually really building things for African and also Latin American countries. And the second reason is to get these resources out, to basically create more supply globally for these resources that hopefully can lower the price as China ramps up its demand. And finally, also political reasons, and to basically, get closer to African countries as a geopolitical plan. But it's not about competition with Taiwan anymore, as it was up until fairly recently, about 5 years ago. It's much a more broader global strategy. And in Africa, it has actually raised a lot of problems. But the interesting problems that you see, if you read the newspaper, a lot of what has been happening in Africa actually is not so much the Chinese government giving soft loans to build infrastructure. It's actually Chinese traders, people from various Chinese provinces going into Africa, either on these state-sponsored construction projects and then staying on, or just migrating for better opportunities, and going into African markets and starting to be direct competitors with Africans. So Zimbabwe, for example, is going to clamp down on all these Chinese shop owners, etc. And we've seen riots because of this. And it seems, and you have private Chinese entities going in and strip mining areas in parts of Africa for these resources. And that is what causes often a lot of the friction, interestingly, much more so than what you kind of would think is those big projects that are kind of state-sponsored. For the most part, the friction there has been actually not so large. It's more, although there's some mining issues with, where you have Chinese-owned mines, there have been problems, but not so much with building railways and roads, etc., unless you get land rights issues involved.
It's interesting to see the influence of Chinese government and Chinese people going out there in the world, and part of the challenge is can they sustain a positive influence there? And it's definitely something we need to watch out and hope for the better, right? We're just out of time. I have to wrap up. And this is Hong Jiang, Asia in Review at Think Tech Hawaii. And we'll be speaking with Professor Chris McNally about challenges to China's rise. And thank you so much, Chris, for being with us.
Thank you.
And I want to thank our production manager Ian Davison, communications director Chrissy Golfigan, and our producer Jay Fidel. And thank you for tuning in. And this is Hong Jiang at Asia in Review. And I'll see you next Tuesday. Thank you. Goodbye.